Buenas tardes a todo el mundo. Ante todo, decirles que me produce una gran satisfacción poder presentar en este Centro Cultural de Miami una exposición que sobre todo tiene por meta el presentar a los jóvenes arquitectos. Contamos además hoy con la presencia del señor Riley, que es un honor para nosotros tenerle aquí. La exposición, yo creo que Jóvenes Arquitectos de España, es una exposición necesaria para entender la posición clave de nuestro país en el panorama arquitectónico internacional. En el año 2006, en el MoMA en Nueva York, Terence Riley era comisario de la ya mítica exposición On-Site, una amplia retrospectiva sobre arquitectura española contemporánea que hacía oficial ante el gran público lo que ya era sabido internacionalmente entre la crítica especializada. España se había convertido en una potencia mundial en arquitectura, desde el premio Pritzker Rafael Moneo, pasando por Alberto Campo, Otuñón y Manchilla. Gran número de arquitectos dibujaban en aquella exposición un presente consolidado y reconocible de esta disciplina. Año 2013. Presentada originalmente en el 2008, la exposición dirigida por el catedrático Jesús Aparicio y que hoy presentamos, Jóvenes Arquitectos de España, es tremendamente relevante, pues nos muestra a través de su contenido que hay una impresionante cantera de jóvenes arquitectos capaces de dar continuidad a las exitosas generaciones anteriores recogidas en la exposición del MoMA antes citada. Pero también no es exagerado afirmar que el prestigio de la arquitectura española no hará sino acrecentarse en los próximos años, pues está siendo capaz de conseguir lo más difícil, mantenerse al máximo nivel durante casi 2 décadas y conseguir una continuidad de generación en generación. Creo que contar con arquitecto español hoy en día es desde hace años una apuesta ganadora. En esta muestra encontraremos obras que, a pesar de haber sido realizadas por arquitectos en el inicio de su carrera profesional, demuestran una calidad igual e incluso a mayor altura de otras trayectorias más consolidadas en el tiempo. Cierto es que esta exposición marca un cambio de ciclo, pues recoge las obras construidas a la sombra de la bonanza económica de los años anteriores que los profesionales españoles supieron aprovechar y gracias a su esfuerzo convirtieron las inversiones públicas y privadas en construcciones con un valor cultural que ha trascendido a su coste económico. Es que hay que entender que la arquitectura no es un gasto, sino hay que considerarlo una buena inversión. El diseño es valor añadido y consiste en conseguir a todos los niveles el mejor resultado posible con los medios de los que se disponen. No perdamos de vista que en el presente estamos construyendo el patrimonio arquitectónico del que disfrutarán las generaciones venideras, así como ahora disfrutamos de lo construido en el pasado por promotores y arquitectos que no solo se limitaban a resolver problemas técnicos, sino que entendían que su responsabilidad social y su prestigio personal en la construcción de ciudades atractivas para sus habitantes y visitantes. El Centro Cultural de España ha querido que esta exposición venga complementada también con acciones de diversa índole que invitan a los ciudadanos a acercarse y a conocer las capacidades de la joven arquitectura española. Porque en el fondo no debemos olvidar que el último fin de la arquitectura es resolver las necesidades de los ciudadanos, tanto las físicas como las emocionales. Y sin usuarios no hay arquitectura. Les doy las gracias de nuevo por estar aquí esta noche y quisiera simplemente añadir que el proyecto no es solamente la presentación hoy de esta exposición que mantendremos a lo largo de, yo creo, un mes y medio, sino que pretendemos también que con una cierta regularidad haya actos o eventos aquí en el Centro Cultural, conferencias sobre todo pronunciadas, y tenemos ya agendado el martes 12 de marzo a las 7 de la tarde una conferencia pronunciada por Rafael Fornés y su título es From Classical to Vernacular American Architecture Heritage en Habana, y el martes 19 de marzo, también a las 7 de la tarde, Los Ciudadanos Importan, que pronunciará Manuel Claverbajo. Muchas gracias y cedo la palabra al comisario.
Muchas gracias. Es un honor para esta exposición estar hoy aquí en el Centro Cultural Español de Miami. Mi nombre es Jesús Aparicio, soy el comisario de la exposición, como ha dicho la cónsul, y quizá voy a contar un poquito la historia de esta exposición. Esta exposición nace por iniciativa de lo que fue el Ministerio de Vivienda, hoy englobado en el Ministerio de Fomento español, que me pidieron comisariar esta exposición, una exposición que al principio no sabía muy bien qué quería hacer como exposición. Finalmente me dijeron que les interesaría una exposición de joven arquitectura española. Me pareció una idea fascinante y nos pusimos manos a la obra. Quisimos que esa exposición no fuera una exposición cerrada, donde solamente, al tratarse de jóvenes arquitectos, donde solamente fuera mi visión personal la que sacara a estos arquitectos a la luz, y al final pues decidimos hacer una convocatoria abierta a la que se presentaron más de 700 proyectos. De esos 700 seleccionamos los 62 que tenemos hoy ahí en la sala expuesta. ¿Cómo se llegó a esa selección de los 62? Pues a través de dos jurados unipersonales. Por un lado, con Kenneth Frampton y por otro lado, Johanny Palasma, seleccionaron. Yo fui un testigo de cargo, meramente, un secretario de los jurados, seleccionaron una serie de arquitectos. Les pedí que seleccionara cada uno a 60 arquitectos, y así lo hicieron, que eran los que estaban previstos inicialmente. Y cuál no sería nuestra sorpresa cuando la coincidencia, sin haber estado juntos, fue del 95%. De tal manera que había 3 arquitectos que solo tenían un voto, no sabíamos cómo resolver el problema y era bien fácil. Al final se incluyeron a todos los que tenían al menos un voto, pero 60 tenían 2 votos. Alguno menos era. Pero esa fue la historia un poco de la selección de los proyectos. Y a continuación, bueno, pues se inauguró esta exposición en Madrid, una exposición que ha itinerado por toda Europa y Estados Unidos. No voy a enumerar todos los sitios que he estado, porque realmente esta es la 16ª apertura que ha tenido. Pero lo que sí quería destacar es el perfil de arquitecto que sale después de esta selección. El perfil de arquitecto es un arquitecto que tiene su oficina, su despacho profesional, oficinas que no son muy grandes, que a la vez compagina esta actividad profesional con la docencia, muchas veces con la enseñanza. Sí, pues son personas interesadas o que compatibilizan lo académico con lo profesional. Entonces, ese es el perfil de arquitecto, yo creo que en general en España y en esta joven generación también. Como ya ha hablado la cónsul, es para nosotros un honor tener hoy aquí a Teresa Randy, que es importante desde luego en el mundo de la arquitectura y en el mundo de la arquitectura española específicamente, porque fue el comisario de la exposición. Yo creo que fue justo cuando empezó esta, fue justo anterior, que fue la de on-site en el MoMA. Teresa Randy fue el curator de arquitectura del MoMA, el director del Museo de Arte de Miami, el MAM, y desde luego un arquitecto que ha perdido la profesión y al cual quiero agradecerle que haga la introducción oficial. Gracias.
Thank you. It's wonderful actually to see this show. I should probably give you a brief history of the show I organized at MoMA called On Site. I actually was in Spain for another reason. I was planning to do an exhibition on new public spaces, meaning stadiums, auditoriums, places of assembly, if you will. And I was driving from Madrid all the way to San Sebastian and back across Cantabria to La Coruña and down to Lisbon. And somewhere on that trip I realized, rather than do this global show about auditoriums, arenas, theaters, stadiums, why not do a show in Spain? Spain was in this unbelievable moment. This was early 2005. And I was actually able to create an exhibition that was mainly almost 90% projects in construction. And I think those of you who remember those years, after the millennium, there was every skyline and every Spanish city was covered with cranes. And the whole country was under construction, it seemed. And what's very interesting, there's no overlap between this show and this one. When I organized at MoMA, for one thing, mine stopped in 2005, and this one continued from 2005 until 2008 was at the frame. And so it in many ways is a complement to the show. The two shows are complementary. I see these two shows as being what I call part of the third wave of Spanish innovation and architecture. The first wave was in the early 90s, where Spain hosted both the Olympic Games in Barcelona and the World's Fair in Sevilla. And just a few years after the new constitution, Spain stepped onto the world stage with these two major events, and I think surprised everyone, including the Spanish, how confidently and competently they administered both the Olympics and the World's Fair. I know a lot of Spanish architects who thought that would be the high point of their life. They thought it was something they would never see again. And then we see the second phase, which I call the millennial phase. Bilbao, Prado extension by Moneo, the Ciudad de las Artes y Ciencias in Valencia. Part of this ongoing trend, but also like all these millennial projects around the world, a little bit perhaps, I don't want to say hysterical, but I mean the kind of scale and the grandiosity of this moment kind of superseded a lot of cooler thinking. But this third wave, what I think is so interesting about this show and the show that you see outside, is its diffusion. This is not the millennial architecture. These are actually sometimes quite modest projects, but they're also diffusely distributed throughout the country. A hallmark, I think, of both exhibitions is that they absolutely, the architects come from around the country and the projects come from around the country. We tried to show a spectrum of age, from very young architects to more senior ones. This exhibition, of course, focuses on younger architects. Project also, I should say, the exhibition I did appeared in Madrid, and this is the Spanish catalog. It's very comfortable for me to see all these projects because they actually sort of fit into the idea that we had. In the essay that I wrote, it was entitled Contemporary Architecture in Spain, Shaking Off the Dust. And I'll just read the opening paragraph. In 11th century Europe, following the uneventful passing of the feared first millennium, so much building was underway that a monk later recalled, It was as if the whole world had shaken off the dust of the ages and covered itself in a white mantle of churches. A millennium later, Spain is again shaking off the dust of the ages, creating itself a mantle not of churches, of which it has plenty, but of airports, museums, hospitals, libraries, train stations, stadiums, and auditoriums. Virtually every region of the country boasts a wave of new works of architecture, recently completed or in construction, of the highest design ambition. In what might be considered the last burst of the Enlightenment, Spain seems to be determined to correct the civil and cultural deficits that are a legacy of not only General Francisco Franco's military rule, but also the Counter-Reformation's mix of authoritarianism and religious orthodoxy. That was a kind of big mouthful for opening, but I believe then and I believe now that it wasn't just the growing economic situation in Spain at the time, and of course there was a huge economic growth from the last years of Franco into the 21st century. I think people today forget how poor Spain was in the last years of Franco. I think the statistics around 1960, which many people in Spain remember as not so long ago, the per capita income for the country was $300 a year. Spain, after World War II, was an extraordinarily poor country in Europe and well behind the level of living throughout Northern Europe. When Franco died in 1975, it had risen to $1,500 per year. But by 2004, after the democracy movement and the liberalization of the economy and admission to the EU, it had risen to $23,000 a year. Now, this kind of economic explosion, I mean, this is really a transformation in one generation from one of the poorest countries in Europe to almost the equivalent of the Northern European countries, is astounding. But it doesn't explain the burst of creativity. You know, it's perhaps the fuel that fueled the fire, but the creativity is not simply something you can adduce to finances. So there were four kind of, why Spain? Why was Spain able to do this when many other countries weren't? And so there were four chapters in the essay that I wrote. All roads lead to Europe was one. Of course, it's a play on words from the Roman times, the phrase all roads lead to Rome. But I think that it's absolutely true that architecture became a principal tool in Spain's Europeanization. And if you look at probably the most glaring barrier between Spain and the rest of Europe was the fact that European trains could not cross into Spain. There was not only the Pyrenees and the sort of political mountains to get over. The European trains literally had to stop at the border. People had to get out and they had to get in the Spanish trains, which were on a narrow gauge. So the very act of using EU money to transform the infrastructure, transform the traveling infrastructure, most clearly the train stations and the railways, is a great example of how architecture became synonymous with the move into Europe. The other thing is how Spain began to imagine itself within Europe. During the Franco years, two of the mainstay, of the three main pillars of the economy, one so-called liberalization of the investment practices, two, remittances, which were a huge part of the Spanish economy during the Franco years. Spaniards, 10% of the Spanish population worked outside of Spain, sent money, hard currency back. But most important was tourism, and Spain promoted itself to Europe as the cheap, or to the world, as a cheap vacation destination, the retirement village of Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a huge source of hard currency and stabilizing the Franco economy. And it also, in many ways, meant that the Spanish people had to imagine their country more as a kind of tourist fantasy than as their own home. And in fact, during the last 15 years of the Franco rule, 9 new hotels were built per week for 15 years. And as you all know, people have been in Costa Brava, those kind of touristy places, those buildings were of dubious kind of quality, they were just thrown up, they were cheap beach place hotels to satisfy the kind of fantasies of tourists. Probably more interesting was the Franco era policy of also highlighting the historical cities and the development of paradores, which meant taking historic buildings, monasteries, castles, etc., and turning them into vacation hostels. And of course, all of this is great, except in a certain sense, it meant that the historic cities became set designs for this kind of tourism and almost immune to any kind of contemporary architecture. What you see as Europe joins the European community is just a lot of changes in their attitude. For one thing, cheap tourism had gone to North Africa and the Caribbean. Spain had to adapt to a higher level of tourism, the whole notion of cultural tourism. And I think few countries adapted so quickly and so positively. I think it's very interesting that Bilbao, the Guggenheim Bilbao, of course, happened in Spain. But what's also interesting is that after the success of the Guggenheim Bilbao, so many smaller cities in Spain broke the rule of the Franco era about historic cities and contemporary architecture and actually embraced contemporary architecture as a part of cultural tourism. And I think, with great success. Conference centers, the Marqués de Riscal winery with a Frank Gehry hotel, catering to people who want to learn about wine, learn about gastronomy, taking cooking lessons, winemaking lessons. This is a whole kind of tourism that is quite different than what Franco imagined in the 60s. The next chapter was called Spain's Indissoluble Diversity. It was a play on words from the Spanish Constitution, which refers to Spain's indissoluble unity. And I think that if any country was ever programmed to create a diverse range of styles of architecture, it was Spain. I mean, the climate, the topography, from the mountains in the very north, the Pyrenees, the Andalusia with this almost African blazing heat, the Meseta, the central portion of Spain, and its kind of elevated flatness, the Canaries, which truly are African, and they are the same latitude as southern Morocco. This is a landscape that is meant to produce different architecture. And the irony of the Franco years was that Franco, of course, used architecture to try to create a nation. And the Francoist architecture in the Canaries was the same as it was in the mountains, the same as it was in the Meseta. This was to create the sense of discipline and order, etc., that was intended to. And in the new constitution, of course, the various regions of Spain were guaranteed autonomy to a certain, much greater extent, and I think laid the foundation for this notion of expressiveness from region to region that was not typical before. I think that beginning with Enrique Miralles is also the great Catalan architect who died, unfortunately, far too early. The notion that architecture could be a form of personal or artistic expression also began to take hold. And I think that in the projects out here, the projects that were in the on-site show, this notion that architecture is more than something functional, but is something that's kind of potentially expressive, was given great sanction by figures like Barrios. But if you look at the history of Spanish architecture and the history of Spanish culture, this isn't so new. I mean, Spain has always given a certain privilege to artists, even in the ages of absolute orthodoxy and autocracy. Gaudí, I mean, what better example of a person whose architecture is totally as a means of kind of expressiveness. And if you look at Goya, the work of the painter Goya, certainly, or Greco, you know, for centuries, Spain has revered the artist as a kind of a person with an exceptional voice. Perhaps the biggest change in these two exhibitions is not that architects are included, because I think they have been in the past, but the extent to which society in Spain had allowed the definition of architecture to kind of transmute into something more specific. Now the next chapter, and I think there's only a couple more to this too, I think, urban rights, urban privileges, derechos urbanos, privilegios urbanos. I undertook a kind of study of the, if you will, the DNA of Spanish architecture, which I think is its urbanist quality. And this is something I think that is so ingrained in culture in Spain. It's one of the guarantees that Spanish architecture doesn't become kind of homogeneous and typical like everywhere else. And the reason is that it has these historic cities that are so rich in context that it has enormous influence on the architecture. And when the Romans invaded the Iberian Peninsula around 20 BC, they brought with them the kind of style of the Roman legions, which was both destruction and kind of ruthless expansion. But the foreign legions were also engineers. They were responsible for the construction as well as the destruction. And immediately after occupying Iberia, the Romans went about this process of strategically planning the development of the country. And when the Romans had invaded, there were about 400 towns or hamlets, urban, well, it's, you know, these are small cities, but I mean, there was about 400 identifiable habitations that we might call urban at some level in Spain at the time. They identified 100 of them that they believed should be the one to grow. The cities that were on important roads, the cities that were on junctures in a river. You know, they took a very strategic attitude, and they gave the people that lived in those cities special rights and special privileges in order to reinforce them as the kind of backbone of Spain. Of those 100 cities, 70 are still occupied, with a combined population of almost 12 million people. In other words, 25% of Spain lives in cities planned by the Romans. This is a phenomenally important way of thinking about how Spain has grown almost continuously since the Roman period. And the Moors that followed them certainly had the same attitude towards urban life. And various historians, when they talk about Seville, Granada, great Moorish cities, say that in the 12th century, undoubtedly the most sophisticated, the most civilized, the wealthiest cities in the world were within Moorish Spain. This means that architecture is never an isolated element. It's always seen in a context. And I think it's a reason that Spanish architecture has been so strong. And in the last chapter, I tried to sort of sum up what my feelings were about this notion of Spain as a European and a modern country. And I want to read you a little bit as a kind of background. I mean, today we think of Spain as both modern and European, but it wasn't always, or it wasn't, let's say, obvious that that's the way Spain would happen. And I don't know what his reputation is anymore. Miguel de Unamuno, am I saying that correctly? Unamuno? I don't know what his reputation is, but writing in the early part of the 20th century, he at least has a lot of wit. He says, the term European expresses a vague idea, very vague, excessively vague, but much vaguer is the idea that is expressed by the term modern. If we combine the two together, it would seem that they ought to limit one another and result in something concrete, and that the expression modern European ought to be clearer than either of its two component terms, but it is vaguer still. And then he goes on to argue for passion over rationalism and traditional wisdom over science, inverting what might be called the progressive point of view. As his examples, he evokes St. Augustine and Tertullian, both figures from the moment in history where one could be African, Roman, and Christian, and offers them as an alternative paradigm for a culture influenced by all three. The great ancient African. Here you have an expression, ancient African, which can be opposed to modern European, and which is at least of equal value. St. Augustine was African, and he was of the ancient world, so was Tertullian. And why should we not say we must Africanize ourselves ancient-wise, or we must ancientize ourselves African-wise? And I think what his kind of clever dialogue there points out is that there was a certain time, probably in the 20th century, where Spain could have imagined itself more as on the rim of the Mediterranean and more allied with the countries on the, say, other side of the Mediterranean, which are quite close to Spain, and without giving up its notion of being a kind of Roman, classic Roman culture, or a Catholic, a Christian one, because as he points out, St. Augustine was all those things. But I think what's very interesting for Spain is how it has approached, and I think what we have to look at is how, if Spain is now modern and European, despite what Unamuno might have thought, how is its modernity and its Europeanness different than the rest of Europe? And I think it's a very important thing to note. In terms of architecture, anyway, the modernity, modern architecture, as we sort of know it, the kind of international style, the Neues Bauen architecture of the 20s into the post-war period. This was an architecture that appeared very briefly in Spain, and then with Franco, more or less disappeared, emblemized in the career of José Luis Sert. Trained in Paris with Le Corbusier, was a kind of amazing, important conduit for early modernism to Spain. When Franco takes power, he leaves Spain and, like many progressives, leaves Spain for the United States, or you can point to any number of other people moving to other places in the world. It can be almost emblemized by one building, the Barcelona Pavilion, built in '29. It's taken down after the fair. It's rebuilt in '86, the year that joined the Europeanization of Spain might be said to be complete. So I think it's emblematic because in a certain way, since Spain did not go through the typical path of modernism, especially with regards to architecture, it also never suffered the degradation, if you will, of modernism, the corporate takeover of modernism that so many people have written about. For so many Spanish, modernism remains much more fresh, much more alive, and I think that if you look at this exhibition here, or look through the catalog of my exhibition, you'll see that there's a very frank and accepting attitude towards modernism, and it's certainly might even be thought of as proof that postmodernism is really a fatigue about modernism, and it's clear that Spain has not suffered that fatigue, that modernism remains kind of vital in Spain in ways that it is not elsewhere. And finally, this is the notion of being European. I don't know how, the first building block of the notion of unified Europe was economic, and it had to do with coal and steel. It had to do with the Netherlands, Belgium, a few northern countries that, in order to rationalize the industry, they began to lower the tariffs for steel and coal between these countries. That incremental process carried forward in Northern Europe with hardly a moment of drama. It started very small and it grew. Perhaps the euro was the moment of drama. But certainly for Spanish, who actually had a choice, could think of it. Do we want to be part of Europe or not? This is not something that happened in Holland, for instance. There was no moment, no referendum, do you want to be European or not? It was something that built up over time. But the Spanish were certainly offered the opportunity to say, do we want to be Spanish or do we not? And I think that both in terms of being modern and being European, you have a much more spectacular sort of acceptance and transformation in Spain than elsewhere. That means the modernity of Spain and the Europeanness of Spain are actually quite different. And I think this is something that still continues to play out. When I was asked by Jesus to do this response, I was a little bit nervous about picking up my old catalog that I had written. I was afraid, gosh, so much has gone bad in Spain as of late. I was, thinking, I wonder if what I wrote actually is going to still make sense. And I actually think that by emphasizing the kind of deep roots of contemporary architecture in Spain, the current problems and the current economic difficulties, actually, I was happy to see, in my mind, actually shrank in comparison to the accomplishments that have taken place in Spain, over the last 50 years or so. As bad as the economy is now, I think Spain has to still be considered the EU's biggest success. Of all the new countries that entered at the time Spain entered the EU, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, Spain by far, used the investment of the EU funds in the most successful, and most long-term impacting way. I mean, Spain really used the EU funds to transform the country, not simply dress up the capital, not simply to fund some big projects, but to essentially and fundamentally transform the country. So in that light, I would like to think of the current situation in Spain as transitory and passing, and that as far as architecture is concerned, the fundamentals will continue to provide a platform of great innovation. Thank you very much. Questions or one?
Pues we can ask.
Is
there any question?
I would like to make a comment. It's not a question, but I'm actually writing a book now on the Spanish period of architecture during the Franco period. And I'm not the only one. You can start to find PhD even in American universities about that period, and of course in Spain itself. And I think that There's two things. I think that sort of dichotomic view of Spain during Franco is starting to change. Because in reality, there was a lot more architecture going on during that period than the literature has actually told us. And in a way, Spain was very isolated, including in terms of its capacity to publish across its own borders and to actually diffuse its own culture. And I think and then after the end of Franco, I think actually Spain has become the most successful in propagandizing their architectonic and urban achievements. And of course it started with Barcelona, Bodegas, and all of that. But the truth of the matter is that even though the vitality of Spanish architecture is without any contest, it is also one of the countries that has been the most destroyed since 1975. And I had, for example, a copy of Greenpeace, a Greenpeace report published, I believe, 4 or 5 years ago about the destruction of the coast of Spain, which is probably one of the most awful process that has ever taken place in Europe. And I would say the coasts of Florida are probably better protected than the coast of Spain. I myself have been driving from Malaga to Almeria, Murcia. It is a scenario of hell. But that is actually never published. And so what is interesting is it's also tourism that actually has destroyed the coast. But what is very interesting about the comparison between the Franco period and the post-Franco period is that highly urban, when Franco actually controlled tourism, even to the point that tourism would happen in cities. Benidorm, Torremolinos, and all of those things, they're highly concentrated urban environment which were completely master planned. And there was relatively few few suburbanization. The period of the opening of Spain has also opened suburbanization. And in fact now all the tourism that is happening in Spain is basically invading the countryside, invading the hills. And so what is interesting is that during the Franco there was no communication really about what was happening, and there were good things. And then in the post-Franco period there's extreme capacity and precision in the communication, but it's also hiding the other phase. So I think it's very interesting. And the last point I want to make is that in reality, many of the architects who eventually exploded in the 70s, 80s and started this movement, of which all those young guys are actually the sort of next generation, many of those architects actually started their career during Franco. I mean, a person like Bodegas in Spain, which was so instrumental to generate new architecture and bring up the new architects in Barcelona, actually his first building is 59. One of his first buildings is 59. 60 years before, without counting with Delamo, about Carrero, about Coder, all those people. So I think the history of architecture in Spain, still and of course, I mean, this is not taking any.
This is taking the, a very quick. And I actually agree with you about the diversity and what's being uncovered about the architecture during the Franco era. What I was really talking about is Francoist architecture, in the sense that it's rumored that Franco actually helped design the monument at the Valley of the Fallen. Yeah. I mean, he actually participated in this. And if you look at the Franco monument in the Canaries, I think it's in which Canary, I don't know. But like this symbolic architecture that was planted all over the country, memorializing the regime, the Catholicism, etc. This is the architecture I'm kind of referring to. But and what you said about the coastline, actually, if you think about it, the Romans killed the coastline. The first major work that the Roman legions did in Spain after taking over the country was they built I think it was called the Via Augusta, that went from the Pyrenees to Cadiz, like 2,000 kilometers or something, and they built it in 3 years. And so they took all these maritime cities whose only connection was the sea and turned it into the main circulation artery of Spain. It was coursing all along and so even in the worst sense, the Romans influenced this development from, and I don't know where Benidorm, I don't know when Benidorm came into being. It sounds like a Latin word. Could be the way.
I mean, 1960, Benidorm is 5,000 people inside the village.
But thank you. I'm glad that Spain is more and more on the dashboard of what people are studying. Time for wine.
¿Y qué te hace falta?